Clara Whitfield had walked 11 miles from the ruins of her family's homestead with nothing but a cloth sack of belongings and Rusty, the blue heeler who had been her father's dog before he was hers, and by the time she reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, her boots had worn through at the heel and her spirit had worn thin in places no boot leather could protect. The bank had taken the land 3 days after her father's funeral, the note called due by a man in a suit who had never once set foot on the ranch he was so eager to claim. And Clara had stood in the yard where she'd been born and watched strangers walk through rooms that held every memory she owned, and there had been nothing to do but leave. She had come to Silver Creek because it was the nearest town large enough to offer work, and she intended to find a position as a seamstress or a laundress or anything at all that would keep a roof over her head, but she had not counted on the boarding house rules, posted plain as day on a hand-lettered sign in the window of the only respectable lodging in town. No animals permitted, no exceptions. Mrs. Ainsley, the proprietress, had looked at Rusty with the particular disdain some people reserved for anything that might track mud onto a clean floor, and said that Clara was welcome to a room, but the dog would have to go. Clara stood on the boardwalk outside the boarding house with Rusty pressed against her leg, his ears low, sensing without understanding the crisis unfolding around him, and she felt something break inside her chest that was worse, somehow, than losing the land had been, because the land was just dirt and timber, but Rusty was the last living thing that remembered her father's voice, that had slept at the foot of her parents' bed through every hard winter, that had chased off a mountain lion the year the drought nearly took their herd. To give him up felt like giving up the last thread connecting her to everything she had lost, and yet she had nowhere else to sleep that night, and the temperature was already dropping with the promise of an early frost. It was in this moment of raw, unguarded despair that Jake Calloway found her, though he would later say he hadn't so much found her as nearly walked straight into her, being more occupied with the mule he was leading down Main Street than with a young woman crouched on the boardwalk with her arms wrapped around a blue heeler's neck, tears she was fighting hard not to let fall standing bright in her eyes. Jake was a rancher some 6 miles outside town, a man the local gossips described as a confirmed bachelor, gruff, private, more comfortable with cattle than conversation, a man who had buried his own share of grief when a rock slide took his younger brother 2 years back and had since kept mostly to himself and his land. But there was something about the picture in front of him, a woman clearly at the end of her rope, a good dog sensing her distress and pressing closer rather than further away, that stopped him cold on the boardwalk in a way nothing had in longer than he cared to admit. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, and his voice, though rough with disuse of gentleness, carried none of the impatience Clara had grown used to from strangers these past 3 days. "I'm fine," she said, which was a lie so transparent that even Rusty seemed to look at her reproachfully. She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her wrist and stood, gathering what remained of her composure like a cloak pulled tight against the cold. "Mrs. Ainsley won't allow the dog in her boarding house, and I haven't anywhere else to take him, and I don't quite know what I meant to do." Jake looked at Rusty, who looked back at him with a frank, assessing gaze dogs reserve for men they are deciding whether to trust, and something in that exchange seemed to settle a question in Jake's mind before he'd even fully formed it. "Blue heeler," he said. "Good stock. Worked cattle. His whole life. My father's ranch before." Clara stopped, unwilling to explain the whole sorry story to a stranger on a public street, but Jake, perceptive in the quiet way of men who spend more time reading land and animals than people, seemed to understand there was a wound there he oughtn't press on. "I've got a spread 6 miles out," he said instead. "Lost my hired hand to the goldfields last spring and haven't found anyone worth their salt to replace him. I could use a dog that knows cattle work, and truth told, the bunkhouse has been needing a woman's hand in the kitchen and the mending since my mother passed, if you'd consider honest work in exchange for board. Both of you. There's a room off the kitchen that's sat empty a year now. Wouldn't be charity, ma'am. Wouldn't be anything but a fair trade, work for keep, same as any hand I've hired." Clara stared at him, searching his weathered face for the catch, the trick, the ulterior motive she had learned to expect from men who offered women like her anything at all, but she found nothing there except a plain, unadorned honesty that seemed almost startling in its simplicity. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I could be running from trouble. I could be a terrible cook." The corner of Jake's mouth lifted, the first hint of humor she'd seen cross his face. Dog like that don't attach himself to bad people. And I've been eating my own cooking 18 months now, ma'am, so I promise you can't do much worse. He extended a hand, work-roughened and sure. Jake Calloway. Clara Whitfield, she said, and shook it, and Rusty, as though sealing the arrangement himself, sat down squarely on Jake's boot and looked up at him with an expression of such open approval that Jake laughed outright, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did Clara. The ride out to the Calloway ranch took the better part of an hour, Clara perched on the wagon seat beside Jake with Rusty curled at her feet, and somewhere along that dusty road, watching the mountains change color as the afternoon light shifted, Clara found herself telling him the whole story after all. Her father's death, the bank's swift cruelty, the long walk to town with nothing but a dog and a sack of clothes to her name. Jake listened without interrupting, his eyes mostly on the road, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "Land's a hard thing to lose. I know something of that too, though mine went a different way." He did not elaborate further, and Clara did not press, sensing in him the same instinct toward privacy that she recognized in herself, the careful guarding of wounds not yet ready for daylight. The ranch house, when they arrived, was a sturdy two-story structure of hewn logs and stone chimney, well built but bearing the particular bareness of a home lacking a woman's touch. Curtainless windows, a kitchen stocked with only the barest necessities, furniture arranged with function rather than comfort in mind. Jake showed her to the small room off the kitchen, which was clean if sparse, and told her supper was whatever she could make of the larder, and then excused himself to see to the evening chores, leaving Clara alone in a stranger's house with a dog and a fluttering, uncertain hope she hardly dared examine too closely. She made a simple stew that night from the beans, salt pork, and dried vegetables she found in the pantry, and when Jake came in from the barn, cold and tired, and sat down to a hot meal waiting at his own table for the first time in over a year, something in his face shifted in a way Clara noticed but did not remark upon. Rusty positioned himself beneath the table between them, and by the time the meal was finished, he had already claimed a spot by the hearth as though he had lived there his whole life. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither Clara nor Jake had quite expected, but both found themselves, separately, grateful for. Clara rose before dawn to bake bread and start the morning's chores, mended shirts and darned socks that had clearly gone without attention for months, brought order and warmth to a house that had been merely functional before. Rusty, true to his breeding, took to the cattle work as though he'd been born to Jake's land instead of Clara's father's, and within a fortnight Jake was telling anyone who would listen in town that the dog had cut his mustering time nearly in half. In the evenings, after supper, Jake began lingering at the table rather than retreating immediately to his own affairs, and Clara found herself doing the same, and slowly, over shared cups of coffee and quiet conversation that stretched longer each night, two people who had each built careful walls around their grief began, without quite meaning to, dismantling them brick by brick for each other. Jake told her about his brother Daniel, about the rock slide that had taken him while they worked a fence line together, about the particular guilt of being the one who walked away when someone he loved did not, a guilt Clara recognized because she carried her own version of it, the guilt of a daughter who had been in town buying supplies the day her father's heart finally gave out, who had not been there to say goodbye. They found, in each other, a rare and precious understanding. Not pity, which neither of them wanted, but the plain recognition of a fellow traveler on a hard road, someone who did not need grief explained to them because they had walked its particular geography themselves. But it was not only shared sorrow that drew them together. Clara found herself laughing more in those weeks than she had in the 2 years since her mother's passing, delighted by the dry, understated humor Jake revealed once he trusted someone enough to let it show, charmed by the gentle way he handled the horses, moved by the evident care he took with every creature on his land, herself and Rusty included. And Jake, for his part, found himself watching for Clara's step on the stairs each morning, found the ranch house feeling like a home again rather than simply a place he slept, found himself thinking, with a mixture of hope and fear he had not permitted himself in 2 years, that perhaps a man could love again after all, could risk the terrible vulnerability of caring for someone new without it being a betrayal of everyone he'd already lost. Trouble arrived, as it often does, in the form of assumption and gossip. Silver Creek was a small town with a long memory and an even longer appetite for speculation, and it did not take many weeks before word spread that the widower Calloway had taken in some drifter woman and her dog, and the whispers grew uglier with each retelling, until by the time they reached Clara's ears second-hand through the mercantile clerk, they suggested arrangements far less honorable than the truth. Clara felt the sting of it deeply, not for her own reputation, which she had little enough left to protect after losing everything else, but for what it might cost Jake, a man of standing in the community, a man who did not deserve to have his name dragged through gossip on her account. She raised the matter with him one evening, awkward and halting, suggesting perhaps it would be better if she found other lodging, took work elsewhere, spared him the talk that was clearly making its way around town. Jake set down his coffee cup with a deliberateness that told her he had been expecting this conversation, dreading it even, and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Let them talk," he said. "I spent 2 years letting other people's opinions keep me small, keep me alone, telling myself I didn't deserve to want anything good after Daniel died, like grief was a debt I had to keep paying forever. I'm done living that way, Clara. If the town wants to gossip about a rancher who's fool enough to fall for the best thing that's walked into his life in years, they can gossip till they're blue in the face. I don't much care anymore what Silver Creek thinks of my choices." The word fallen hung in the air between them, unmistakable, and Clara felt her heart lurch with a hope she had been too afraid to name even to herself. "Jake," she said softly, "you don't have to say things you don't mean, just to make me feel better about staying." "I've never meant anything more in my life," he said, and crossed the small distance of the kitchen to stand before her, close enough that she could see the sincerity plain in his eyes, undisguised now, no longer hidden behind the careful reserve he'd worn like armor since she'd first met him on that dusty boardwalk. "I offered you work and a roof that first day because it seemed the decent thing to do for a woman and a good dog in a hard spot. I did not expect that woman to walk into my house and my life and make both feel like something worth waking up for again. I love you, Clara Whitfield. I should have said it sooner, but I was afraid, same as I reckon you've been afraid of trusting anything good after everything you've lost. But I'm not afraid anymore. I want you to stay, not as hired help, but as my wife, if you'll have me, and Rusty can keep his spot by the hearth for the rest of his days, and there won't be a single soul in Silver Creek fool enough to gossip about a married woman living in her own husband's house." Clara felt tears rise, but these were nothing like the tears she'd fought back on the boardwalk weeks before. Nothing like grief at all. "I came to this town with nothing but a dog and a sack of clothes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never imagined I'd find a home again, let alone a family. Yes, Jake. Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch house. The same kitchen table that had first hosted their quiet suppers now draped with a borrowed lace cloth and laden with food brought by neighbors who had, in the end, proven far kinder than the gossip suggested, many of them confessing over cake that they'd suspected all along the rumors were nothing but small-town nonsense, that anyone with eyes could see how the widower Calloway had come back to life since Clara Whitfield walked into it. Rusty sat through the entire ceremony with a red ribbon tied jauntily around his neck, courtesy of one of the neighbor children, and when Jake finally kissed his bride before the assembled crowd, the old dog let out a single approving bark that made everyone laugh, as though he alone had known from that very first day on the boardwalk exactly how the story was meant to end. Years later, when their own children were old enough to ask about the worn, gray-muzzled dog who slept by the hearth every winter and followed their mother everywhere she walked, Clara would tell them the story of the day she had nearly lost everything, standing on a boardwalk with nowhere left to turn, and how a rancher with sad eyes and a mule had stopped to ask if she was all right, and how that single small kindness had become the foundation of everything good that followed. She would tell them that sometimes the worst days of your life are simply the doorway to the best ones, if you're brave enough to walk through them, and that a good dog, it turned out, could recognize a good man long before his own heart was ready to admit it. And Jake, listening from his chair by the fire, would only smile and say that he hadn't done anything particularly remarkable that day, had simply offered a woman and her dog a home, and that everything else, the love, the family, the years of happiness that followed, had been Clara's doing entirely, a gift he counted himself fortunate beyond measure to have received. If this story warmed your heart, Don't forget to hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next tale of frontier hearts finding their way home.